afternoon where we really start to head into that and really try to provide more and more opportunity for that kind of thing to happen. But we have a little bit more of the consume phase of today, leveling everybody up on what I consider sort of the tier one projects and aspects of what we're doing. That's intended to provide a foundation for us so we can all have sort of more intelligent, well-informed conversations about when we're looking at different ways we can work together and move forward. So, we started off, Arpit this morning started us off with the big picture of just the impact open source is having and the transformative effect across the industry. There's a lot going on in the networking space, and the Linux Foundation is really providing the umbrella for that activity. And so, we've asked Arpit to come back now as we sort of head into the second half of the day to get more specific about the networking space and how the different pieces fit together. And in particular, you hear about ONAP and you hear about Chord and those two pieces and how they fit together. And it's work in progress in some ways, but there's some vision there, and Arpit can share a little bit there as well. And then we'll talk about ONOS, and then after that we'll be moving back upstairs. So, but with that, ask Arpit to come back up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have the clicker. Okay. All right. So I'm sort of after lunch, so you can take a nap. It's okay. We raise our hands and break. So does this work? I think whoever used the neck. All right. So it's literally an umbrella of projects. And, as I said, Linux Foundation hosts majority of the open source projects. Now, you would claim, is more better, not necessarily. But what I want to do in this session, and it's only 10 or 15 minutes, is at least set a perspective architecturally on where these projects fit in, so that people don't have an assumption that, oh my God, this is the same as this, and this is the same as this, and why do we have 2? Why do we have 7? And there's a use case, there's a niche, and there's a need. And then where there's duplications, we are looking at harmonization. And I'll define harmonization in our terms so that it's clear. But one of the things that we want to establish first is, as you look at the projects on the right, these projects, the end users are enterprises, carriers, cloud, etc. But what is most important is each of these projects need governance. They need, infrastructure. They need testing. They need events, right, like this. They need meetups. They need a whole set of support that allows these projects and these communities to foster. Remember what I said in the morning. It's sustained communities. It is innovation, shared technology investment, right? So for each of these projects, we do it differently based on the needs of the project. But what I want to do is sort of take a step back and explain how these projects all fit in together, okay? And it's a start. And I put this vision out at ONS earlier last month. And I think we've received some tremendous positive feedback from the community that it is, a long time coming. So let's start off with the end game, which is really the top red things, right? You either are providing cloud services, residential services, enterprise services, IoT services. And today the problem is fairly simple. You have a layer of network which is, fragmented and disjoint, and there's a lot of manual tooling. We all know that. We've been there. That's how we came up about 30 years in this industry. And then at the infrastructure layer, you loosely categorize as either data centers or the carrier network or the cloud network. And then there's different types of each of these things, right? And each of these have a specific mechanism that is happening. And what we're starting to see now emerge as we look at all these Linux Foundation projects is a very distinct requirement to automate each of these 3 components separately. Now keep in mind, I'm showing the clouds touching each other, and there's a deliberate reason for that. As cloud automation intersects network automation, you have the whole CNI, and how do you do cloud native versus a hypervisor based. There's a whole interaction of those kind of things that we have to consider. If you're working in a traditional hypervisor environment, like a VMware or things like that, what do you do when Kubernetes comes along? There's the same discussions we had when containers came along. Are they on top? Are they on site? But this is now at the orchestration and the automation layer, right? And so we believe that eventually there is going to be these layers that are productized from an open source perspective, and each of these components will start coming together as a solution. I think Guru mentioned this earlier, which is that's the next big thing that we need to go after. And so with that said, in my view, the network transformation is in the third phase, okay? 5 years ago, we started off with disaggregation, where we said, loosely coupled, we don't want everything from a black box. Let's look inside the box and give us different components. And then trials went on. Last year, a year ago, all these components became production ready, right? People have actually deployed components, right? Whether it's controllers or whether it's data plane acceleration kits or whether it's any form of orchestration, it's deployed as a component. Now, you need a lot of stitching around it, right? And you need a lot of testing around it. But this is the year where I'm saying it's production-ready solutions, right? And I think Guru mentioned this as well. And what that means is, if you take a look at OPNFV's latest release, Danube, right? It's got a full test stack with multiple software projects that got tested, right? And they all fit together, including OpenStack and including DPDK and FIDO and things like that. So up and down the stack, there's a test and an automation framework, which itself is an open source project that is testing this, right? For example, look at OSM, right? For example, which is open source Mano out of Telefonica, right? And Etsy, they tested Onus, right? And they're starting to pull things together. So similar concepts, right? While the market is a little fragmented, and I'll show you the pieces and the pictures together, there's a reason for why we are here, right? And the reason is a slightly different picture to what Guru showed you in terms of the disaggregation, but it is the same concept, which is from a black box, we have just become horizontal in terms of layers. The optical plane, data plane, all those became, servers. The leaf and spine architectures came in. Then the control at SDN caused. I mean, I don't need to tell you this. You guys know the disruptions that happened, right? And so there were all these projects that got started in each of these layers. So one cannot say that, oh, there's just too many projects. Each project has a use case, a need, a community, a niche, a value, and a place in the architecture, okay? And that's the reason why you see a proliferation of projects. Now what happens is, when an area is really complex, people solve it from multiple angles. And then eventually, this is typically the life of an open source project, as things settle down, the few that actually have a big community that really solve problems in a very efficient way, they survive, right? And so what we want to do at the Linux Foundation is sort of put out a proposal here that says, hey, to the community and to the end users, we want to harmonize the open source networking with the standards. Now, what does harmonization mean? So let me define that before I sort of show you the diagram, right? Everybody should know this, right? I mean, if you saw the previous presentations on Chord and could understand it, this is 10,000-foot high view, right? So you got the hardware, you got the abstraction, the data plane acceleration, the OS, the control, the VIMs, orchestration, analytics, and then all the apps, right? Now, in enterprise, you'll call it workloads, and service providers, you call maybe services and product catalogs, but it doesn't matter. And what we are saying is harmonization, there are really 3 steps, right? Step 1 is understand the positioning. So project A, project B, I want the world to make and it's really a marketing and a positioning thing. These are the 5 use cases, these are the 6 use cases, these are 3 overlaps, here's the problems they solve, here's how they are positioned against each other. To me, that's the baseline. Every open source project that exists should at least be at step 1, right? The second step for harmonization is if they are complementary in most, and in most situations they are, right? They complement each other. Then we should at least have a path to interoperability, right? Interoperability, interworking, exchange, whatever you want to call it. And whether it's done through, APIs, north-south bound, remove this, put this in, or into a solution stack like what OPNF we tested with, doesn't matter, right? That's kind of the step 2. And step 3 is if there is heavy overlap, okay, then you merge, right? And when we looked at, say, eComp, which was from AT&T, and we looked at OpenO, which was a Linux Foundation project led by several of the vendors, and again, both about a year and a half, quote, in the open source world. I know AT&T had it for quite longer than that, but in general, there was heavy overlap on certain areas, and there were significant complementary things that came along with both projects, right? Like one had, Yang models, the other one had Tosca, the other one had, you could have an Etsy architecture here, and we've talked about this, right, in the community, but we decided to merge it, and we have received tremendous support and response from the community, vendor community, end user community on it. But that's the end stage on harmonization, right? So when we say harmonization, it doesn't just mean at the end of the exercise we will have one stack, because then we are also a vendor, right? We are not open source community. We need choices, we need complementary things. So that's the general setup of how we see things on networking evolving. And so what I've tried to do with this diagram is I've tried to lay out all projects that exist in networking within and outside the Linux Foundation, and the equivalent standards on the right, okay? So keep in mind, if I want, say, ONAP to interoperate with OIF, that's not going to happen, okay? They don't even, touch the same space. Maybe, I saw Lyndon here, old buddy of mine. Where is he? Lyndon? Oh, hey. Right? From an OIF perspective. But that's just an easy example to understand. But there are standards that are relevant in each of the layers. And then even standards are expanding into adjacent layers. And what happens is we want to make sure that projects that are covering layers are appropriately talking to each other, sharing communities, sharing the APIs, whatever we come up with. So I'll give you some very specific examples. From a hardware perspective, we got 2, OCP and DIP, that are relevant in this kind of, and there's more, by the way. I'm not saying, and every day new things come up, but as we start interworking with these, we'll have that included. For example, OPNF we tested on OCP hardware. That's a great example of harmonization of what you can get, right? Now, at the data plane layer, one could argue, why are there so many projects? And that's a valid question. But if you understand the data plane, then you will see that, say, IOVisor is really a Linux kernel-driven acceleration kit, versus DPDK is a set of libraries that Linux Foundation just announced as a project, of which FDIO builds on top. So there is a method to the madness on this layer if you understand the details of the data plane. However, I would still argue that to the end user and end community, it is not clear. And that's one of our missions this year, to make sure that as these open source projects are hosted, and whether it's inside Linux Foundation or outside, it doesn't matter, right? I think we owe it to the community to do that. And by the way, the dotted line is really, we don't own it. or we don't host it in Linux Foundation, but we are going to work with them, okay? Now, keep in mind, as we go up the stack, things start getting very interesting because you got people going this way, you got projects going up and down the stack, right? Like OpenStack is probably a layer which is very interesting, you know. Cord builds on it, ONF builds on it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the analytics pieces that are coming together. In general, this is a very comprehensive landscape, and if we can figure out, you know, as a technical community on how and what works best in the use cases that the customers care about, you know, we have done a great service to everybody, right? So that's kind of on the traditional networking side. I'm also putting the cloud native side right next to each other because they are solving the same problems in a cloud native way. So you got Kubernetes, you got the Cloud Foundry on the top. This is all the app development that happens in an enterprise. So keep in mind, although it's not intended that way, the left-hand side is heavier carrier focus. The middle one is heavier enterprise focus, right? And the two are coming together as, you know, clouds, enterprise, and carriers, data centers start to look the same. Okay, the software will differentiate what you know, is it a VNF or is it a workload, right? And so what we have been working with is, given this landscape, and if our vision is to automate, you know, enterprise, carrier, and IoT services through the open source disruption, so that, you know, vendors and end users can innovate on the layer on top, because I mean, I would be the you know, I'd be fooling everybody if I say this is a value-added layer to the end user. I mean, AT&T's here, you know, it's like, no, I make money out of products and services from my product catalog, right? This is just overhead, right? I take 6 months to do network on demand, now I can do it with 15 minutes, right? So things like that are just helping and enabling the end user. So with that landscape, we have started active dialogues with almost all the standards bodies, right, as Linux Foundation. I would argue that the ones that lead this from an intent perspective are clearly, you know, ONF, MEF, TM Forum, right? They're and then from a thinking perspective, Etsy obviously because of the OSM, right? Because OSM, and we've had multiple discussions with OSM as well. So what we are working towards here is an end goal that is understandable, it has enough choices, but it at least interworks properly for the use cases that are relevant to the end users like you, okay? That's the big picture, right, that I think I was asked to sort of communicate here before you go deeper dive into the specifics of ONA. So take a few questions here, maybe one or two. I know there's lots of questions, but yeah.
So what's your view on OpenConfig, on OpenRADM? What's your view on OpenConfig, OpenRADM? Because I don't see them on that slide.
You mean on OpenRODM and all that?
OpenConfig.
Yeah, so as I said, this is the start. This is, I've started compiling things that as they become part of the stack, if we have not had full discussions with everybody, it's not like we don't know, we know, is it, so I don't have an answers to those two specifically, but these are the ones that we have started. And I would say they would constitute, I've not done a quote real test here, but they would constitute probably, on this, probably 95% of the ones that matter. Yeah? Any other questions? Is this, I mean, you are part of the community, right? Are you getting pressured or asked to explain how they all fit together? Because this is the way we're going to do it, right? And by the way, just on that note, there is a white paper that just came out from the Linux Foundation that explains how standards and open source work in terms of, it's an educational white paper on how the two are, like from a licensing perspective, from a community perspective, from, how the innovation happens in both. And, that's just the framework of the white paper. We're going to continue issuing examples of some of the best practices. For example, the first one, I'm expecting ONF to be, showing that, yes, the education is good, but let me show you how it really works. And then we'll probably have one that follows with TM Forum, MEF, etc. Right? So, if you've not downloaded this, please do so. Okay?
Good.
Yeah?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good.